Hello everyone, glad to see you again for this video. So how can you quickly tell who you're dealing with? Finally, what's the sign that will tell me if this guy has been seriously trained in survival or not? We're going to see that it's a very simple change in your equipment, but it's a good indicator. We'll also see one of the survival applications that comes from this measure, a measure that, I repeat, is often implemented by experienced people. So I'm not going to build up the suspense. It's just about shoelaces. Take a close look at the laces and you'll get a good indication of the person in front of you. So the principle is actually simple. You'll need to swap your hiking boot laces with Paracord, which will be much stronger, much more durable, and above all, much more versatile. So it's a habit that will give you some good advantages in certain situations and won't be noticeable. You will be able to keep moving around, to travel discreetly. So here, the paracord I have is a bit noticeable, but use black paracord. Give the ends a quick touch with a lighter so you can lace them easily and not attract attention. I've trained over 150 people this year, including many military personnel, reservists, former soldiers, active duty members, and plenty of beginners in survival. To my great surprise, I only found 2 or 3 people who had paracord on their feet. With paracord on your shoes, you'll feel like you're equipped with a real tool, and you'll have a real comparative advantage. So there are a few survival techniques where paracord will make a difference, and we're going to look at one of them in detail today. The technique I'm showing you today is a trapping technique, and it's one of the best trapping techniques for birds. So it can be useful to you anywhere on the planet, with most birds. We'll see why it's so effective and how it can be adapted to different birds. Of course, once again, I have to warn you. To put it simply, all trapping is forbidden in our country. And the technique I'm going to show you today would be considered poaching if it were used. I advise you not to set any traps. So only use it in extreme emergencies in a survival situation, since that's the purpose of this channel. One common question is, why use your shoelaces when in theory you'll always have paracord in your bag? Well, that's usually the case, especially if I'm in an environment where I know I could potentially end up in a survival situation. Unfortunately, as we'll see, the odds are going to be against us. It turns out that the overwhelming majority of people who actually find themselves in survival situations are generally extremely sick. They usually end up with only what they have in their pockets, just what we usually call the first line, which, if they're lucky, is a lighter and a knife. That's where a good first line will be very useful to you, and shoelaces are part of it. Also, you should know that it's a very discreet equipment change, and it's not always easy to recognize. Paracord on someone's foot? Of course, you can do the same thing with a paracord bracelet, which will also be considered as first-line gear. But these bracelets are very conspicuous, and depending on the environment, it might be better not to draw attention to yourself. Of course, you also have the whole range of Kevlar, aramid, or other types of laces that are much more resistant to tension. But for us, they will be less versatile and offer us fewer possibilities. Let's move on to the trapping technique now. So now, I'm going to tell you why. This technique is very effective, even if it's not as impressive as mechanical action traps, which are often shown elsewhere. Those famous techniques where you have a trigger with a branch that acts as a spring and snares birds or other animals. Sometimes, these mechanical action techniques can be effective in certain situations, but they are always slow to set up, and they are also very costly in materials and resources. You will generally need a lot of string to set up this type of trap. So today we're going to use a snaring technique for birds, but it's very simple and streamlined. I'll show you the basic setup. The advantage is that with some paracord, you can immediately use this technique wherever you are on the planet. So first, To make this trap, I'll need a flexible branch like this one here. There we go. And I'll look for one with few intermediate branches here. That's what will really interest me, so I can be as discreet as possible with the birds. So to At each end, it would be important to make a bevel like this, and for the half bevels to be aligned with each other. Our goal now will be to make a perch for the birds. You should know that birds generally avoid going to the ground, and when they do, they are very cautious. So, the minimum height at which birds usually land is the height of a traditional fence, which is about 1.5 meters. So it's at about 1.5 meters that we're going to make our perch. Heights at which they will land quite easily. They will feel safe there while also having a good vantage point. From the moment you set a trap for birds, whatever kind it may be, if you set it up high, in a tree, for example, you will always significantly increase your chances of catching one. So now, now that our perch, let's call it that, is set up, we're going to use our paracord. So it's actually the core of our paracord that we're going to use. We'll see how. So don't make the mistake of taking 650 paracord, which will be stronger than 550 but won't be suitable for this kind of work. So we make sure to use 550, which will have 7 strands inside. Here is how to use it. Now I'm going to cut off the ends that have been slightly burned, and I'll try to gently pull out the core of this paracord. So you can see it's very easy even with 2.5 meters of laces. There you go. You'll notice that it has 7 strands. I'm carefully separating the entire core from the sheath. All right, note. That it's possible to remove 1 or 2 if you want. It's possible. It's a little bit trickier, but it's possible. There you go. 1. Once I have my 7 strands separated, I'm going to set them aside here and redo my laces with the sheath, which will be more than enough. Now I'm going to use the first strand, and I'll use about 50 centimeter for each loop, about 50 centimeters. Each loop is 2.5 meters with 7 strands, so there are 35 loops per set with 2 sets. That's 70 loops total. So now you understand, you can start to see the potential power of this technique. We'll be able to make 70 traps with a well thought out first line, whereas without Paracord, we could make 3 or 4 traps at most. Indeed, setting up 70 snares in a single day is almost impossible. It still takes quite a bit of time. But the snares can be reused endlessly, which means that if you stay in the area for several days, you can increase the number of snares, expand your snare line so that you end up with your 70 snares in the end. So you must not make a mistake. For all trapping, it's not just the quality, but also the number of traps that will determine how many catches you make. It's the law of large numbers. For this type of trapping, you'll need at least 25 small traps to succeed. The Pleiad is a traditional trap, and in the past, the trapping sites often had 1,000 Pleiads. So since this is a snaring technique, we're going to make a sliding loop. I'm going to use the fern to help me help myself a bit in the process. So I do 3 turns at this level, and then I pass the end under the 3 turns. There you go. You should have this kind of knot configuration. Then you take it out of the fern and you have your slip knot. So slip knots, you can make several of them. There are several techniques to make slip knots. This one worked well. It's the one we generally use for trapping. Next, you'll take the other end, the string, and you'll pass it inside. And by adjusting the slip knot, you'll set the sensitivity of the trap and the snare. So next step now, we need to set up the snare in the loop. We're going to install the paracord. The snare needs to have a pseudo-circular shape, which isn't possible with paracord. Since it's too flexible, we'll need to coat the paracord with clay, the sap of a plant, any kind, as long as it's a bit thick, or resin, for example. So here, I'm going to use a bit of clay, but it's poor quality. It's a silty clay that doesn't hold together well enough. So I'm also going to use some fern starch. We'll see how. A bit of clay to start with then. We're going to mess it up a bit. There you go. Top, it's official. It scares the birds less, but you can see that's not enough for the outfit. So I'm going to add the famous fern starch, the fern. It's cosmopolitan. You can find it all over the planet. Paracord. Also, so I use this starch and I'm going to coat my paracord. So it's said that birds aren't too sensitive to smells, which is more or less true apparently. But in any case, all these smells are really already part of the environment. So there you go. That's starch. I'm going to let it dry in the sun for about 10 minutes. So you can also prepare your pliés a little bit in advance. If you are making a somewhat bigger batch, letting it dry for about 15 minutes, let's say in the sun, you will have something much more rigid in a survival situation. In terms of the number of folds placed on the ground, you should start as strong as possible and then reduce. If there are many catches, like many bird traps, this is a trap that will need to be baited. So the right thing to do before setting this type of trap is to observe carefully. You shouldn't waste your time or energy in survival. You observe. And if you think there are enough birds in the area at that moment, you can go ahead with this type of trapping. If that's not the case, there's no point. We'll focus on other prey or other resources instead. After noticing the presence of birds, we'll look at what they're eating, what they like. So there will be berries, fruits, worms, and so on. Everything that interests them. Next, we'll move around a bit to set up the hides. If we move the bait around a bit, the result is better. The birds will be easily attracted by food they like, especially if it's a bit isolated. If, for example, you're trying to catch blackbirds with cherries, stay away from large cherry trees that are full of cherries, as they will be a big competition for you. And there you go. A few minutes in the sun are enough to stiffen the snare, so now it's time to set it up. So I'm going to set it up here for blackbirds. A snare with a diameter between 7 and 10 centimeters, and the height of the snare from the bottom of the snare to the perch is 7 centimeters. So these heights can vary a little depending on the prey that you will be hunting. You have also some leeway anyway. So as a general rule, birds get caught in this type of trap when landing. Sometimes they get caught by the head, leg, or wings. Here, the knot I'm using is the clove hitch and 2 half hitches, which will work very well for this type of trap. There you go. You'll notice that the snare is barely visible with the treatment it received, and that's exactly what you want. Be careful not to damage the snare itself. The sticks need to look as natural as possible so you don't scare the birds away. So now it's time to bait the snare. We do this with wild strawberries to attract the blackbirds. Note that if you arrive quickly after a catch, you often recover the birds alive and without any harm. That can be useful at a base camp. When you want to consume the birds later, it's good to keep them alive. Or you can use them as decoys to attract other animals to diversify your catches. One more thing to remember in survival, all the birds on the planet are edible. There are no exceptions. You won't get poisoned. There's only one thing to keep in mind. Birds that fish at sea may have eaten fish that are deadly to humans. Always clean birds thoroughly, gut them well, and never eat anything from the stomachs of birds that fish in the sea, estuaries, or brackish waters. There's a second category of birds that you shouldn't eat or that will be impossible to eat even though they're not toxic. Generally, when they're well cooked, these are birds that feed on carrion, so you should avoid crows, birds of prey, seagulls, and so on. I've seen dogs that systematically refused, especially to eat seagulls, which feed a lot on carrion. There you go, we've pretty much covered everything I wanted to show you today. A very effective language technique, not well known, requiring few resources from trappers and can be practiced worldwide. So, that's already a good reason, among others, to replace your shoelaces with paracord. Take this small step that could eventually get you out of a rut one day. Thank you for watching this video until the end, and I'll see you soon for a future topic. Future topic.